a revisiting of the permeable surface thresholds based on the last discussion. So we had some discussions about, do we do that continuous? How do we represent thresholds and impervious surface and that kind of thing? So those are the big three. And then I'm going to just start with a quick reminder introduction on a few key concepts, and then we're going to take each of these in turn. And I'm going to try to keep us to about the same amount of time for each of these revisions, just to make sure we have enough time to talk about each. And then if we have time afterward, we can always follow up and talk a little bit more of some of these. So just a reminder about the indicators themselves. These are kind of on the natural resource side for the freshwater aquatic. So the goal is the overall integrity of the system itself. We have 3 criteria for the indicators. The ecological, we have to be indicating other components of the system. Practical, we have to be able to monitor and model them across the whole geography easily. And also the social. And the social is kind of the bonus criteria. If they resonate with a wide variety of people, public land water managers, private, American citizens, that's a thumbs up. It's not, we can pick indicators and revise indicators in a way that may not resonate with all those groups if they're really good, but the idea is it's an extra bonus and we should tend towards things that people care about. And then also, we take this lean startup method. Right now we are at a yearly update cycle for the indicators, so we're just finishing this update cycle for Blueprint 2.1. Where we're focused in on a few of the indicators that needed the most work ecosystem-wise. But this is going to be a yearly process. So basically, fall of this year, we'll enter the next testing and revision cycle. So there'll be an opportunity for improvement, folding in new data, and other things basically every year. So that's the general introduction. A few concepts. Kind of reminders and stuff from the last call that'll be relevant here. One is this idea of the active river area that will be related to some of the indicators we look at. So this is really trying to capture exactly that idea of the active river area itself, the sort of the floodplains, the meander belt, terraces, the riparian wetlands, kind of everything that's actively related to the river itself, not just the individual channel and a small buffer around it. It's particularly helpful as you think about the South Atlantic, where you have fairly large areas that are actively influencing the river. As you get down to the coastal plain, big floodplains, big components versus much smaller as you work farther up into the headwaters. And the second thing that will be helpful is this idea of functional networks. So those of you that were part of the CCAP, the Southeast Aquatic Connectivity Assessment Project, you'll probably remember a lot of this information about the functional networks. But the idea is to try to break up these rivers into connected river networks. So you see a picture down at the bottom. You have a dam, so that you have 2 different functional networks, one being below, one above there. This doesn't capture all the various small dams and obstructions, just the ones that are easily snappable to the flow lines in NHD. So there are some still, even within the functional network, there are some small obstructions and things that are there in reality. But these are breaking the networks into kind of bigger functional parts. Okay, so those are key concepts, key principles that will be helpful for moving forward. Any questions about any of that before we start into the first indicator revision? All right, excellent. Now we shall move on. Okay, so for the first indicator recommendation, and we will look at a couple of options here, is related to the resident fish connectivity index. And so one of the things we've been trying to essentially better connect with some of the existing efforts that are ongoing. This is one of the components that was part of CCAP and will be part of the upcoming TNC freshwater resilience effort that will likely be happening down here in the South Atlantic in the next years as well. And the idea here with the complexity is it's the number of connected stream classes. So looking at how many within that functional network, so think about that functional network, how many different connected stream classes do we have? And that idea from a overall climate change and resilience perspective is that will allow different species to move back and forth. Obviously, some species use multiple stream classes anyways for movement and part of their life cycle, but even ones as certain classes become inhospitable to them having connected classes so they can make it, through and back into the next available habitat is a core component of this. So that brings in some of the resilience factor. We had some discussions earlier with some folks about the network complexity, and we'll be looking at a couple of options. One that's directly about connected stream classes, and another one that relies more on just overall network length. So we'll look at a couple of those next here. But before we do that, one of the things, and you'll remember it from the last call, we've been trying to then use some assessment data, some point level sampling data to evaluate the ecological criteria and how well these new improved indicators are actually capturing what's happening on the ground. And so one of the data sets, we'll be looking at two different evaluation data sets. The one relevant to this one that we're going to be using is the same one we used last time. This is the EPA Rivers and Streams Assessment from 2008 and 2009. Had fish and benthic index insect indices that were consistent across state lines. So you can see the dots. This is kind of randomly assigned across the whole geography into those weightable streams. And so here are the testing results of network complexity versus the fish index within that assessment. So again, number of connected stream classes versus the IBI score, index of biotic integrity for fish. And so what you see on the x-axis is the poor, fair, good score, and then on the y-axis is this network complexity score. So we had pretty good separation for identifying the good sites based on network complexity, just based on some of these diagrams. And this was actually the best predictor of all the other indicators of the actual fish community structure. So each of the indicators so far we had in Freshwater Aquatic were capturing different components of the system. And so the fish, this network complexity was our best predictor of fish amongst all the indicators. So that's initial testing of this network complexity metric based on some point level data. So any questions on that before we move on and look at some of these spatially and a couple options and some trade-offs?
Hey, Rua, this is Dean.
Hey, Dean.
A quick question. This EPA assessment, and this might have been talked about in past meetings, but it's I know it says 2008 to 9, and I understand that generally these programs go in 5-year cycles.
Yep.
So is the 13/14 data be available or available soon? Do you know?
It's just really late. I've been working since last year. I've been working with the folks that had the more recent data that have been involved, and they're still working on it. Last I checked, a couple months ago.
Okay.
I was really hoping we could use some of that even last year, but that's just it is classically late.
Okay, thank you.
I would say so.
Yeah.
But I've actually written a bunch of the scripts and stuff like that, so it will be very easy to retest based on the new data. I've kind of automated a lot of this, so when new data comes out, we can test it specifically for the quirks of this data set.
Gotcha.
Anything else? All right, let's move into the layers then. So on the network complexity side, what we're going to do is we're going to sometimes it's hard to see from the far end. We're going to look at what this looks like in two different ends of the LCC. We'll go a section of the north and then a section of the south. And so you can see in the top right, here's your kind of orientation, and then we'll zoom in a little bit with the base map. So from a network complexity standpoint, so here's your sort of the numbers are somewhat intuitive. One is one connected stream class, 7 is 7 connected stream classes. And what you're seeing is instead of a line, it's depicted as the active river area gets assigned this sort of network complexity aspect. So how connected are you? So that includes that sort of the floodplain pieces and other active parts of the river. So that's what it looks like on the northern side, and you can sort of, in general, that helps you see the active river area. It helps you see some of the patterns you would initially see. One other component, so this is the actual measure that I just showed in the testing that works fairly well on the fish IBI. One twist that we discussed on the last call was just looking at the overall functional network length. So trying to sort of simplify it and saying, well, is this adding any information to look at connected stream classes, or are we essentially measuring the just length of the connected network? You know, the longer the connected network, the more connected stream classes you have. It may be simpler to talk about. So we also developed a version here that just purely looks at network length. So this is the version. They are fairly similar. They're now sort of broken into quantiles of network length. There would be some questions about exactly where we might draw the thresholds and all those other components as well. But they are fairly similar, but it does make a difference from certain riverine systems. The Roanoke looks a little bit worse if you just look at overall length. It kind of has a higher number of connected stream classes compared to its length than a few of the networks. So this is just one example in the northern side of things.
Hey, Rua.
Yeah.
This is Chris. So one of the things it is important to keep in mind is at least for a lot of the coastal systems, there's going to be only a maximum. Well, particularly for the previous slide, there's only going to be a maximum number of segments that can be connected. Mm-hmm. Because they don't have all the way up to 7, so they may only have 4 segment types. So the comparison, you might say, well, it's less connected, but it might be completely connected to as far as it can be.
Yeah, exactly, and we'll get into some of the metrics that'll be a little more relevant on the coastal side, on the fresh and saltwater connectivity. But that is one of the sort of challenges we have so far about how you compare across some naturally smaller versus bigger. From a resilience perspective, having more connected classes does help just overall. But you're right, some of the more coastal networked areas, then regardless of the sort of length or obstruction, do get less prioritization in this effort with this particular approach.
Rua, this is Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Did you consider a normalization of this metric in any way? Like, what's following Chris's comment? What is the maximum, or what percentage of those, perhaps?
We did, and we have not been able to get a good percentage. This is what we struggled for during the last time we tried to take on this indicator with the last connectivity, and we've tried to do which sounds like it would be easy and straightforward, but constantly has all kinds of exceptions and weird ways that end up depicting things in not the way you would intuitively expect or want it to behave. Because that was the first. Ideally, you'd have a sort of length versus observed versus expected length kind of metric, or observed versus connected stream classes. But every time we've done it, especially on the coastal areas and especially around urban areas, is where it tends to get really screwed up.
Yeah.
Especially because some of the data issues with the smaller obstructions and where some of the dams are. So it's an ideal. I think accounting for more of that kind of observed versus expected is where I hope we could get to, but we weren't able to get one that was actually doing what you'd hope, like a normalization that would normalize in the way that you would hope it would normalize.
Right, yeah, okay.
So, yeah, that's been the ongoing challenge of that one.
So, Rua, this is Bill Pine. I guess my question too is, what's the spatial extent that you think you can extend these types of analyses to? Is it just going to be discrete aspects of the LCC area, the South Atlantic LCC?
Oh no, this is the whole thing. All these we're showing. I'm just zooming in so people can see it more easily.
Right.
All these are extended. Well, we can go beyond the LCC boundaries because this is all based on some of the CCAP information and trying to be consistent with some of those metrics that came out of that assessment. But yeah, we can. This is watersheds beyond the South Atlantic, and in theory, we're pretty much at this point could do the whole eastern seaboard, the whole sort of east that's been done, northeast and southeast.
But is this only for at what spatial? At what river scale? So like for the major river base. I guess I'm not familiar enough with how many samples are represented in that region. Is it 10 rivers within that region? Is it just the major rivers, or?
It's the whole hydrography. It's basically everything NHD plus down, and this is coarsened up on the kind of river area. So, we can actually in future blueprints, if we want to drive this down to 30 meters and below, we can do that too. But yeah, this is not a subsample. It's just showing up in the prioritization that's based on the scaling.
But it's still driven by where those IBI samples are collected.
No, this has nothing to do with the IBI samples.
Oh.
Sorry, I didn't want to confuse you on that one. So the IBIs were completely separate from the indicator, and they're just validation. So the IBI is just, okay, we have one indicator that we can model purely by GIS, just spatial information, hydrography, and then the point level sampling is just to then see, okay, well, given all the GIS error and that it's a model, how well does it predict on the ground sample points? So.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I missed that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So this isn't extrapolating out from the points themselves, but just
from those IBI samples.
Yeah.
The 136 that were listed or whatever.
Yeah, and that was just testing whether the purely model-based approach worked.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Really, just a suggestion for moving on. You might try, I don't know if you have enough of the IBIs to validate it, but you might try looking by ecoregion or by ecological drainage unit. That would help kind of break this down into more ecologically logical units that you would expect relationships. Doing it all across your region, is part of your problem. And if you can't normalize by, something more drainage specific, maybe ecoregions might help.
Well,
anyway, just future.
Yeah, and I would say the problem from a validation perspective is this is working pretty darn good for an indicator. That validation, pretty hard to find something any better than. We were going to still break them down. That's actually one of the things on the list of breaking it down sub and trying to get some of the various. You can see some of the poor fair. It doesn't discriminate as well, but the fact that you get pretty strong, significant separation between good and poor and fair in this. For an indicator that's purely GIS model-based and predicting actual point-level sampling data, that's pretty good. So I think it's just more of a measure. The observed and expected question is still open. So that is the piece. That is the variation right now, and the two pieces we had on the table. We're staying with the network complexity, which keeps the consistency with CCAP and kind of future freshwater resilience pieces. And then the alternative is the network length one, which we pulled out just as an alternative to see if they were the same. So the recommendation I wanted to sort of put forth the group for this particular one, staff-wise, was to, for this revision cycle, move forward with the network complexity as a measure for this particular cycle, but then keep pursuing for the next revision cycle, take a look at some other options, like some of the things that Chris said and that came up on looking at improving some of the normalization for different size kind of if there was completely a connected system, the normalization for some of those coastal watersheds in future revisions. So I'm actually going to do this fairly quickly here, but we'll move down. So Beth, thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah, looks good.
Okay, Bill. Bill Pine, sorry.
Oh, no, I that looks good. I'm still sitting here thinking. I'll keep talking. I'll keep thinking.
Okay. And again, I mean, there'll be still, for those that want to spend a little time looking at it, we still got a few more days after this for discussion and tweaks and things too. Okay, so Chris.
First blush, it looks good. I wasn't on the last call, so it's kind of hitting me new today, but yeah.
Okay. Dean?
Yeah, absolutely. At first blush, it looks good.
Cool. Jessica?
I like it.
All right. John?
Which one?
Yeah, it looks good to me. And I have to say, I like the color scheme that you're showing much better than what comes up when I go on the link that you sent out. The map is lavender tones. And there's no more than 4 different colors.
Huh. Yeah, we'll keep working on this. I mean, working on local options so you can customize it, which we've got pretty high, and we can always keep working on some of the tweaks.
And one really exciting thing that we've done is now when you go to the CPA, when you go to the download button for any of these draft indicators for version 2.1, you will download all of the indicators all in one download, so you don't have to download them individually. And so that way you can bring them up on your local ArcGIS, and you can just play with them and really dig in. So.
Yeah, that was great. So now it's one geodatabase. So if you can grab it from anywhere, and you got them all easily organized, and you can tweak.
Right.
Cool. Okay, John Coffin.
I think it looks good. I like the idea of the path forward, looking at the other options too in the future.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right, and let's see, Josh.
Looks good on our end, and I also like the idea that we can download all the indicators at once.
Yeah, that was a good one. Much faster than going one by one. Cool. Okay, Mark Barrett.
Looks good.
Excellent. Mark Cantrell.
First of all, I really like your font. It's well selected. And I think this does illustrate network complexity really well. I'm just still wrestling with the comparing network complexity with the sorts of connectivity sorts of measures that we're also looking at. And so this is a good potential complexity and diversity measure. So just thinking about all the dams and fragmentation issues that I think this will be useful with.
Cool.
So, I think it's great.
Excellent. And Mary.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting concept. I just can't figure out why all the small streams are rated so low, and I see the relationship with the IBI, but I don't know. I'd like to see some investigation along those lines, but in general, I think it's a great concept.
Okay, cool. So that's putting on the normalization and the further investigation, and particular focus on the small streams, coastal and otherwise.
Yeah.
Got it. I'll just take my own extra little notes here to make sure I got it. All right, awesome. Okay, so on to the next topic here. I'll close that off. One other thing we looked at as a follow-up, we also looked at small dam density as a complement to network complexity, particularly because some of those small dams weren't necessarily accounted for in that measure. What we ran, a couple of problems we ran into, and I'll show you another one after that. So some of the thresholds of sort of how much is too much was a bit of a challenge to identify. And there were some data issues we ran into, which I think are you can see some of the results in the testing. There is some newer data available, but we did not have time to incorporate some of the newer data. But this will just sort of show you this image on the bottom. Here's your dam. There are some of these other barriers, these kind of like on small streams that weren't quite mapped. By the way, the scale is wrong in this slide. Eric Martin from the CCAP had mentioned, I forget, I think it's like 1 to 1,000, not 1 to 2,400. So ignore that
100,000.
Or to 100,000. 1 to 100. That'd be a little crazy. Okay, so we took a look at that. And here also is the testing. We really found basically no relationship between the small dam density and any of the IBIs in our testing, the fish or the benthic IBI. So same as you looked at before, but here on the left you got the benthic IBI, on the right you've got the fish, and it really wasn't predicting the scores at all. So this is probably, most likely this is not a conceptual problem with using small dam density. It's just a problem with the data we have available, and shows that data, at least that we had at the time, is just not quite ready to to be used in that way. All right. Any questions about that before we move on to the next indicator?
Okay? Can you review that the y-axis?
Yeah. So on the y-axis, this is density of small dams. So just looking at, these are the small ones that weren't mapped in CCAP, and so essentially. And I actually even tried some quadratic functions and some others looking at thresholds, and pretty much any way you slice it, the higher density of small dams, so we'll go back up here, and this is upstream and downstream in those pieces. You can, those little dams that weren't quite mapped, and the density just didn't really have any relationship, even with some quadratic equations and other things.
Is it because that at least my guess would be that maybe a large portion of the small dams are in headwaters, and so you may have a real high density, but it's not really affecting where your IBI samples were taken if they're taken further downstream. So it may not be just the two different data sets are looking at two different things, and you're not going to see any relationship.
They had them pretty well distributed when I was looking at points from like big streams to headwaters, because I think they stratified different types when they did the selections. So there were sampling higher up in the headwaters, and there did not seem to be a strong relationship just going from, coastal plain, Piedmont, headwaters, towards the bigger streams. But that could be part of it. There are some known issues with entire sections of the geography that are missing a lot of these small dams, which is also probably another issue. But yeah, I mean, that's also as a simple metric of just small dam density. You could have a lot of dams that just really aren't immediately affecting the center part of the river. So that's also possibly part of it as well.
On the Conservation Planning Atlas, maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but I thought they had the number of dams divided by the area in square meters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so looking at the legend, even point 1 would be one dam per every 10 square meters, which just doesn't seem realistic.
I think the numbers, I forget, there's an issue with the scaling on that too, where the numbers are not actually, it's like an order of magnitude off, I think, I forget if it's in the documentation, but yeah, I did those numbers too, and I forget what the issue was, but it was just in the writing, it wasn't in the calculation problem.
Yeah, I apologize. There's a problem with the legend there, and I forgot to go back and fix it since we're probably not going to be using this indicator, but you're correct. That legend is wrong.
That was it. Because I had the same thing. I was like, wait a minute, hold on. This is a mini. Oh, that's impossible. It would be all dams. But yeah, so it's a legend thing.
Okay.
Any other questions on that one before we move forward, or thoughts? I think we've got some good thinking on probably multiple issues that are that are going on with being able to capture this and test it. All right, so moving on to the next stage. So this is the fresh and saltwater connectivity index. So for those that were involved in this discussion before, one of the things we went back and forth on was how much, and the reason it's sort of freshwater and saltwater connectivity is how much to build in information about the Adgermus species into this measure. And before, we didn't really have a good way of accounting for some of those questions about, well, why do we care so much about fresh and saltwater connectivity, and are there some places that might be more important than others for connectivity just based on species that are moving back and forth between those systems? So now we have a potential update and two options for you to look at, and that includes renaming this to a migratory fish connectivity index now, because we're recommending bringing in some species info from Atlantic sturgeon, Gulf sturgeon, striped bass, blueback herring, and Alabama shad as a way of looking at how far some of these species are actually getting up into the river network and what classes are actually used by them. So it's a combination of where they're stopped by major dams and also where they're stopped purely based on ecology. So we'll look at a couple of different options for that. And so this time I'm going to start in the southern part of the range, and then we're going to move up to the north part in North Carolina as well to zoom in. So this is an example from the Georgia area, and let me pull my mouse here up. So what you're looking at right now, again, this came from CCAP, and you're looking at some metrics of purely just the sort of line range of how far out some of these different species can make it in. So your darker blue is based on your sturgeon. And you can't see the Gulf as much over here, Gulf and Atlantic, but about how far up your sturgeon are able to make it. So kind of your biggest, hardest fish to actually make up some of these river networks. And then your lighter blue is where things like your Alabama shad over here and your blueback herrings start kicking in. So we've done a little bit of testing with some folks. I know Mark Cantrell and a few other people. We started by looking at the line work of making sure these lines are kind of capturing how far some of these species can go up. And then the next step, it was translating it into something that isn't just a line, because obviously those fish are impacted by things beyond just the immediate line down the river network. So two ways to look at this, and both have their pluses and minuses. One way is to intersect the entire functional river network with the sort of lines of those ranges, which is fairly broad, captures a whole lot of stuff. On the plus side, not a lot of stuff is left out that's feeding into those areas that the things like a sturgeon is going to go to, and I'll go back and forth here. On the negative side, some of these areas that are not really accessible, that are pretty far from areas accessible to some of these migratory fish, are included as very high priority. So if you look along the Altamaha River here, the sturgeons only go up so far, but then when you pull it up, you have all kinds of other sections of the functional network and all the different tributaries that end up as very high priority, kind of the highest value in this particular metric, partly because there's an ecological reason why some of these species stop at certain places beyond just dams. So the alternative to this is not clipped to the Puck 12 subwatershed. So this is pretty much potentially overrepresenting the areas you might want in here. And then we have another version, and this is kind of the staff recommended tweak here, which is clipping those areas just to the Huck 12 that's along where that line works. So now you're hugging a lot closer to where these species are most immediately affected. And so now here you see, it's a little bit more selective, but also some of these areas where sturgeon aren't able to go right now get a little bit lower value than the areas where they're actually immediately there. So that's the the two different approaches basically were, overrepresenting here, but potentially underrepresenting a little bit when we're clipping just to the subwatershed. And I will show you the next one. Will show you the up in the north, the sort of northeast part. So here we are in eastern North Carolina, and show you an example with the Roanoke that shows the downside of doing it this way. So here's not clipped to the subwatershed. You have a whole lot of places that are identified in that highest class, and you've got the pretty much through that whole Roanoke floodplain is higher. And then this next version is now clipped down to the subwatershed. And so one of the downsides, as you all know, the quirks of this sort of subwatershed element is that sometimes this will provide a little bit lower value. I should have put a little circle in here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but if we go back and forth here in this section of the Roanoke floodplain, you'll see just purely by how some of the subwatersheds are delineated, there may be a few places that are ranked a little bit lower. Often these come out really high on all the other indicators and still end up in the highest priority class in the blueprint in the end. But pretty much the trade-off is, being overly selective and kind of maybe a little bit too high in a lot of areas for migratory fish, or maybe sometimes being a little under-selective in some places. So those are the two options. Right now, the staff recommended version is this one clip to Huck 12, because although it's not perfect, it seems to perform a little bit better in getting closer to directly where some of these migratory fish actually are right now. So I'm going to open that up to questions and thoughts on that metric.
Well, if no one else is going to jump in there, it's Chris again. So a couple of things, in no particular order. One is, so this doesn't include eels, which, again, I wasn't on the last call, so that is one thing that I'd like to hear some discussion on. Although, having said that, maybe, the unclipped version it would be a way to get at that, the eel aspect. Another point is I'm wondering why American shad weren't included, or instead of, or in addition to blueback. I mean, to me, they use very different extent of the river, locations and type of habitat. So that's two things dealing with species. And then I've got some other questions as I looked at this morning. There are some examples, the Tar River, for example, that you have here, where there's a dam at Rocky Mount that is not somehow stopping sturgeon in your analysis here. So I don't understand how sturgeon are getting all the way up a lot farther past a known barrier. So there's just some maybe details about some of either the dam layer or what, I'm not sure.
Yeah, we'll have to go back and look. So you're saying that at this point there's a dam that shows up before Rocky Mount. So this is more of an error in that line work, that sturgeon actually can't make it past Rocky Mount up here. So
and then the converse of that, on the PD River, it stops at the state line, even though there's nothing stopping sturgeon even from going up all the way to Blewett Falls. So kind of the opposite issue there.
Yeah, I'll have to take a look, because I know a lot of folks looked at these layers before as part of that CCAP, but that's part of looking a little bit closer and seeing where there might be some errors in the underlying line work. So I'm taking some notes on fixing those things, because those are.
And I guess while I got the floor, the last thing is on the lighter blue, which is like, when I looked at it, it was showing up as either striped bass or blueback in North Carolina. So again, like PD River, for example, it's showing that is being connected all the way up above High Rock Lake, even though there are 6 major dams in the way currently. Now, at some point, there'll be some connectivity provided by some trap and truck or fish lift kind of passage facilities, but currently those don't exist for those species, and so it should not be showing at this point anything above Blewett Falls all the way up to the head of High Rock or even above. So that's another issue in my mind.
Yeah, let's take a look at that. I'm pulling some of these pieces in to get some validation and on some of those pieces. So, excellent. Okay, so maybe take those in turn. So these are errors in the line distribution. So I've got those for follow-ups here. And so partly the reason for not including American shad in that initial proposed layer was that, at least from the line work, even though they're using different parts of the river, the range was exactly the same in the data. That doesn't mean we can't generally just sort of had defaulted on trying to use as few as possible just to get the actual models and pieces right. But, I mean, that obviously could change if there are situations where you think connectivity for American shad and blueback herring could drastically or could majorly diverge based on future conservation actions. So that's certainly something we could look at bringing back in. Eels, I mean, one of the things we had with eels, and they weren't included, at least in the line work from this, not because conceptually they're not a great species, and we'd originally intended them to be the sort of, okay, what's going to have the easiest time getting through some of these major obstructions, but do you actually have are you aware of something like this, some similar line work of eel distribution across the South Atlantic, Chris?
No, I'm not.
Because if we had it, I mean, that was one of the things I wanted. It was kind of obvious. If we had those data, I would totally want to put eels in there, because I think they would be another level after some of the river herring and as another component. It was more of a lack of data for eels, not a desire to not include eels. They're, a great indicator and shared pieces, and if there were some data we could use to spatially depict that, that would be awesome.
What about from ASMFC? Wilson would be the person to ask that when he gets back.
Yeah, I made had some questions, and there are like eel models and things in development, but as the last I checked, which admittedly was, I think, more than a month ago now, but that's sort of as a follow-up, I can double check to see where they're. A lot of. I know they've finished some of the sort of habitat relationship spreadsheets and things, of like what habitats might you find, but I haven't found anything that actually gets at the connectivity, like where the eels are. There's a lot of efforts going on, and I was really shocked for something like American eel that there isn't something as basic as like, here's where they are now, or at least that I couldn't find it. But I'll put that as a top priority on moving forward, unless any of y'all. I talked with Wilson about this before. I'll double check to see if there's anything new, and with maybe with Jimmy Johnson and a few other people to see if there's any new GIS for any eel distributions.
Yeah, we have compiled as much data as we could regarding just sample locations. Same as Marist data or any of the other point locations that would maybe allow us to get at those uppermost points in stream network. But again, it's sporadic.
Yeah.
And not coastwide, and certainly a lot void from the Gulf.
Yeah. That could be a good further investigation one. I mean, does anyone have any conceptual problems with adding, things like American eel if we had the data? Given this kind of approach of trying to get at different levels of migratory fish connectivity. Okay. All right. So I've got a couple notes here. Other thoughts on these different options, and then we'll kind of go to a decision next steps thing, and then we'll go on to the impervious surface. We'll hit that fairly quickly.
Real, just a quick question for
Yeah.
This is Dean again. It just raised a question in my mind about, say, the eel data.
Mm-hmm.
To have it included, would it have, how much of the landscape would you have to have the data for? Is it 90% or?
The whole geography we'd need.
You'd have to have the whole geography to incorporate it. Then, right?
Yeah, I mean, basically, at least other, or a model based on those data that could extrapolate to the whole geography.
Gotcha.
Because we want to really depict all the places that the eels actually were, and wouldn't want to, favor a place just because there was data and say, well, yeah, the eels are better here than over here.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right, I'm going to go through real quickly here again for the group. So basically, next step was, I think the proposal here would be getting your thoughts on going with this clipped version, clipped to the Huck 12 for the migratory fish connectivity. We can add back in American shad as a species, and also two other action items for that. Keep working on American eel to see if we can get some line work for American eel out of anywhere, and then maybe if it's not this cycle, maybe it's next cycle, to fold that in, and also do a little bit of try to improve some of the line work as far as especially some of the places around Blewett Falls and the sort of sturgeon around Rocky Mount, and try to see what we can do on improving the line work this cycle, and then if not, move it to the next cycle on improving some of that line work as well. So those are the big proposals on follow-ups, and then proposed thing for this indicator revision. So I'll go down the line. So we'll start with Beth again.
I think all the proposals you just stated are good. I agree with the staff recommendation. I do like the one clip to the Huck 12 better.
Okay, Bill? Bill Pine?
We had to step out for a call.
Okay.
I'm here. No, I'm here. I think it's good. And I think revising it to include eels and some of the other anadromous fish. I was just reading on the assessment page. They've prioritized getting habitat information, but it doesn't look like anything new is included on the habitat, nor has it been funded, so it's probably not out there yet. You haven't.
Yeah, that was that's the latest I heard too.
Yeah. So no, I think it's good what you've got.
Okay. All right, Chris, given a few of those follow-up items we talked about.
Yeah, I think, in addition to what I've already said, of the clipped and non-clipped, I think the clipped is probably a better first cut at things than the non-clipped.
Okay, good. Dean?
Thumbs up.
Jessica?
I agree. I think going with the clipped at the first shot is probably the better way to go until you can kind of reassess.
Cool. Sounds good. All right, John Faustini.
Looks good to me.
John Kaufman.
Clip version sounds good.
Okay, cool. And Josh?
The clip version looks good.
All right, that's good. Getting some good consensus on that. Mark Barrett?
Yeah, the clip version looks good.
Excellent. All right, Mark Cantrell.
Yeah, I agree with the clipped version as representative as we add other species potentially, or break down various life stages of things like the large-bodied sturgeons. If we look at juveniles, we may find that we're going to get out from the main stem of the river. As we add American eels, we'll certainly see that network enlarge again, so we may have to revisit what's representing each species as part of that total migratory fish group as possible.
Yeah.
We may also want to include, if we're adding species, things like our riverine migratory species, such as robust red horse, Carolina red horse, and evaluate how they're moving about in these networks.
Yeah, that'd be a good one for that.
But being able to add species and to refine the depiction of those ranges, along with the dams and other functional barriers or physiographic changes, I think will be really neat to illustrate how these species are good indicators of the ecosystem functions.
Excellent. All right, Mary.
Believe it or not, I have no opinion on this. This is kind of out of my area of expertise, so I defer to the folks that know it.
All right, gotcha. All right, excellent. So we've got a good path forward on that one. And then the last thing, which I'll move forward fairly quickly on, was looking at this permeable surface question. We talked on the last call about thresholds in permeable surface and whether instead of sort of a continuous permeable surface indicator, we wanted to do something that was highlighted specific components of the percentages of impervious surface, the classical above 10%, below. So here's some testing that we did. In this case, it was North Carolina. Pulled some of the North Carolina water quality sampling from a whole mess of water bodies. This is the 2006-2010 data, and Chris Cujo probably knows this data very, very well. And just looked at some fairly simple sort of supporting versus not supporting aquatic uses on the permeable surface. And here's what the plot looks like. So permeable surface per catchment on the x-axis, and then probability of meeting that water quality standard is on the y, and sort of plotted the uncertainty pieces on this as well. So we didn't really necessarily find a lot of evidence, and most of the permeable surface was in this above 50% section, but didn't find strong evidence for that sort of classic right at 10% threshold drop-off. It was a fairly straightforward relationship. And in testing other versions, other weighted indices of permeable surface, they did not perform anywhere near as well as just the simple kind of linear relationship with permeable surface. And I guess one of the questions even for me, where was that 10% threshold in there? And actually went back to a meta-analysis by the person that did the original analysis that set that 10% threshold, the sort of Schuler et al. And there's a lot of evidence for a far more continuous relationship, including that most regions showed a generally continuous but kind of more of a gradient. And this is actually his updated impervious surface model shows a more continuous sort of cone of instead of very specific breakpoints. And that seems to fit with all the different variations in how cities and urban areas deal with or don't deal with stormwater very well and deal with impervious surface. So based on that, we're recommending sticking with the just the regular, the continuous depiction of impervious surface. So that's the final one. It's just sort of a follow-up on the discussion from the last one about thresholds. So any thoughts on that or closing comments before we close out the call?
What was the water quality standard? Like, did you sort them out as far as the class or group of water quality that might have been violated?
It was particularly, a lot of the variations was, there were a lot of sort of more specific nutrients. There were nutrients and particular sort of chemical violations were some of the bigger ones that came up a lot. And we tried to separate, just ran out of time for separating out each individual type of violation and use.
Right, just because I was thinking some might just cloud the situation, like if you're thinking about PCBs or something like that.
Yeah, what seemed to happen overall for the water quality stuff is that the permeable surface did best with some of the chemicals and sort of harmful bacterial blooms and things like that. The current riparian indicator captures the benthic index the best. The network complexity captures the fish community the best. I threw them all into some of the regressions on some of these, and they do actually seem to be capturing different components of impairment well that the other ones are not.
So, Rua, this is John. I'm still thinking that it's not very sensitive at the high end there. I guess I still have some heartburn about using permeable surface as opposed to impervious surface because it's a small relative change to go from 100% pervious or permeable to 90%, and it's a big relative change to go from 0 to 10% impervious. And so I think it's hard to capture a response when you flip it like that.
Numerically, because we're treating them in the same way, numerically it's no different. From an actual optimization, prioritization perspective, saying permeable versus impermeable, like in the models and all the things like that, 90% versus 10% is no different. I mean, this is the one we just basically, for all the communication on the indicators, for all the interfaces, we kind of, to avoid confusion, we have to have everything consistently, basically more is better. And this is the one example where it's just we're so used to talking about impervious surface. So it is a little bit of a mental reconstruction. Quantitatively, it doesn't really make a difference. We're just calculating it as the inverse at this point. Now, there are some potential improvements. I think Mary's mentioned some related to permeable surface where we might look at, in the future, different levels of permeability instead of just permeable versus non-permeable. But numerically, there's really no difference between how we calculated before and how we did through just flipping the wording in the scale.
Okay. Well, I guess not being familiar with the details of how you're modeling it, it does seem like it would make a difference, but
yeah, no, it doesn't. But yes, sorry for the confusion. This is just the one exception of all the indicators that we gotta have to just flip to be good, which is a little squirrely. All right. Well, thanks a lot, everyone, for joining the call. We're at least a couple minutes over. If you have some other thoughts as you move forward that maybe you couldn't think of now, or you go look at the layers afterwards, we're going to try to wrap up, at least for this revision cycle, the improvements by the end of this week. But feel free to pick up the phone or send an email like, oh, I forgot about this, or what about this piece, or here's a suggestion, or something like that. Feel free to send them along, and thank you all for all your time taking a look at this stuff.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Rilla.
Bye, everybody.